Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to our webinar on rethinking performance management. My name is Victoria Simpson and I am part of the Kineo Asia Pacific team based in Melbourne. We're delighted to have today Chip Cleary from the Kineo US team presenting our webinar or speaking around the topic of performance management for us. Just to introduce Chip slightly, Chip has been part of our Kineo US team, which is based in Chicago, for 2 years. But he's actually been involved in the world of learning and development for over 20 years, or since 1991 actually, when he joined the Institute for Learning Sciences at Northwestern University. He actually went on to get a PhD from Northwestern University as well, in addition to an MBA from the University of Chicago. He has been a strategy consultant with the Boston Consulting Group and became an early member of the Cognitive Arts, where he led design for the corporate division, and then after that for the NIIT's advisory service practice for over a decade, in which he oversaw over 100 engagements running across performance consulting, outsourcing assessments and strategic training assessments. So he's coming from a very high caliber background. Just before I hand over to Chip, just a couple of basic kind of housekeeping items to let you know about. If you have any questions, if you want to just pop those in the question pane, and I will ask those questions intermittently of Chip as we go through each section of the presentation. And we also have a few polls to ask everybody whilst we're going through the presentation. So just to let you know, we'll be launching those at certain points throughout this webinar. But that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Chip, and I will speak to you again when I ask the questions. Are you there, Chip? Are you ready to go?
Absolutely. Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, and thanks to everybody for joining this morning. I hope you have a cup of coffee with you as we get into this. Appreciate you taking the time. So today we have a range of content to go through that's around a really interesting, I'd call it almost tidal wave of action that seems to be happening in HR and talent management these days, where there's a little bit of fire and I'd say an awful lot of smoke around this idea of how do we handle our performance management processes, and in particular, how do we handle that annual review that we so love to hate and convert that to something which just makes more sense to business leaders, to employees, and in fact HR people. And so I'll spend a couple minutes just setting the stage about how we kind of define the topic that we're going through today, rethinking performance management, get a little bit of sense of who's in the audience today, and then we'll begin to unpeel the onion as we move through the hour. So the annual review process is just, something people love to make fun of. I think, first thing many employees think of when you think about how is your performance managed within your company, they think of that thing that happens at the end of the year that can often feel like the organization is making you jump through hoops to complete some arcane process that those devils in HR have somehow created for you. In point of fact, I think that what many organizations find is that the process is a little less than that. In fact, instead of it being overwhelming to employees, it can often be underwhelming. We'll come back to this scene as we walk through the day, but this is Dilbert cartoon, and from Scott Adams, one of the great critics of large industrial or how large industrial organizations work, and here's Ashok, who just got his annual review. Got a text message from his boss: keep up the work. Okay, not really that helpful in helping Ashok figure out how to craft his future as he works through the company. It's not only that employees hate it, it's also that, in fact, when many HR leaders think about how they manage performance, and they think in particular about that annual process, that they realize that it just hasn't gotten to where they wanted it to be. And so what we're going to be talking about today is really, what's the shift that seems to be going on. I mean, I call it a bit of a tidal wave, and at least in the North America these days, towards rethinking how we handle performance management. Why now? Why is it coming up now? And if you want to succeed at trying to make a change in your organization, what are some thoughts you should keep in mind? So we'll go through that. But as we get into this, let's first take a pause and get to the first of those polls that Virginia mentioned to you. And in fact, Virginia, if you can open up the poll at this point. Let's first just ask a couple questions about who's here today. And the first one is, how happy is your organization with how you handle performance management today? Rate from 1 to 5, from low as, absolutely despondent, we couldn't be doing a worse job, we write cartoons about ourselves, to 5, ecstatic, those cartoons you showed don't have anything to do with our world, we really are happy that we figured it out. So let's give you just a few seconds to be able to respond to that poll. So 1 to 5, give 5 more seconds, and then Virginia, let me ask you to go ahead and close that. Looks like the results are not very many who are in the depths of despair, so congratulations on that. On the other hand, nobody sort of crests the midline. So most of the population is the step away from despondent. And then 42% of us, in fact, there are a few who crest the midline. I correct myself. 42% are at the midline, and 5% of us are actually feeling like we're doing better than just average. We're moving towards ecstatic. So, as we go through today, that 5% of you who put yourself at a 4, please do chip in comments and questions in the box so we can learn from your experience. That's something that most of us would like to be able to mimic. Okay, so that's question 1. Virginia, let me go ahead and ask you to open up the second poll as well. The second poll is, many of us said, in fact, most of us said we're not that happy with where we are now. Where are you thinking about making a change? How likely are you to change your approach? And, here, you just made a change, you're in the process of changing it now, you're thinking about changing it, nope, you're standing pat, you're comfortable with where you are, so you're not really planning to make a change. Let's give you about 10 seconds to respond to this and see where we land for today. Okay, about another 5 seconds. And then Virginia, let me ask you to close that one. Share the results back. Okay, so just to feed that back out, more than anybody, almost half the audience is in the process of changing now. So hopefully today will be helpful to you as you do that. Another third of you are thinking about our plans, beyond thinking, planning to make a change. And then there are a few who are standing pat and a few who have just been through a change. So most of the audience here, over 3/4, are between in the process of making a change or planning to make a change. So it's a timely to join this session. Okay, just to talk a little bit about how we see the problem. The consensus seems to be is that when we think about performance management as an annual process, that this is a little bit what it feels like to all the players involved. That there's this odd, huge rock that sits there on the crest at the end of the year that we deal with, once a year, and it's just different than the rest of our life. It stands out, and it's a little bit difficult for us to deal with. And since it happens once a year, it's a big rock. It's a high-stakes process that we go through, even though it feels funny. And this notion of taking a performance management process that has great intentions, but is really organized as a big stake Let's set our plans once and carry through on them. This is a kind of problem that's been faced in other places in the world. And we think is what part of what's happening in the world today is that we in HR are beginning to think a little bit like the folks in IT have been thinking for the past 15 years, which is how can we move away from this waterfall process where we start out by once a year writing a big concept spec document that we then try to execute against for the rest of the year. How can we move to something that kind of breaks that down and is much more agile? Because goals change too often, it's hard to project. We get new data as the year goes on. So this notion of let's pause once a year and write things in stone feels awkward. Whereas if we can try to move towards a more agile approach, we can stay better aligned, it will feel more comfortable, and we'll feel less charged when we're trying to make the decisions that go into the annual process. So really what we see happening is many organizations trying to break up that big rock at the end of the year and essentially make it into a series of grains of sand. Sort of break it down into a series of grains of sand. And that's a lot of emphasis today on companies thinking of throwing away the annual process altogether. There's a lot of energy around new technology that will allow us to kind of continually have conversations around performance and alignment, so to get to that grains of sand. And what we see is really at heart, though, this notion is let's move from the waterfall model of once a year big stakes to many small conversations that make sense. And I personally, am a huge fan of this idea and have had kind of some good experience with how it works over time. So just to give you a little bit of my personal background as we get into today, you saw a picture a few minutes ago about what I look like today. This is what I looked like back in 1987 when I was beginning as that strategy consultant that Victoria mentioned up front when she was giving you a little review of my background. So back in 1987, I was fresh out of business school. I was going to work for a strategy house. And I was kind of a cub consultant wet behind the ears going on to the job. Went to work with this organization, the Boston Consulting Group, and had just a fabulous experience with how performance was managed inside BCG. What really is stepping back from that, the challenge that consulting organizations like BCG have is how do they transform people who look like this? I mean, how do they transform me, the cub consultant, over the course of 7-8 years into hardened, seasoned, seen it, been it, consulting partners who can create tremendous value, And so how do we take people who may not have a whole lot of practical skills, frankly, if you think about the typical business school graduate, and convert them into people who can really make a huge difference in the world? And to do that, they have this large performance management process. Because of the size of that need, they put a pretty rigorous process in place, which didn't feel that different than kind of grains of sand. Back in those days, work at BCG was organized around 6-week projects. At the end of each project, there was a standard form that you and your manager worked through that talked about 16 different dimensions of how you worked on the project. Those forms were accumulated every 3 months initially, every 6 months later to be wrapped up to give kind of a summary. Then coming out of that summary, the organization gave you a short list. Here's 1, 2, 3 things you need to work on in the next 6 months. And by the way, here's the 3 things we're going to make happen so that you can do that. And this process was very time-consuming. It was done with papers and photocopies, and it was rigorously followed because BCG cared about it. I think what we're seeing today is, and by the way, that process was hugely valuable to me as an employee. I mean, I had a clear picture 3 months in about what my development goals were for the next 3 months, and I got the support that the organization promised it would give me to get there. So a hugely valuable process. I think what we see happening today is essentially trying to take that process that was so critical to BCG that it was willing to invest senior leader time in, administrative time in, employee and manager time in to make happen, so really be followed it rigorously, but to try to make that easier for a typical organization that may not feel exactly the level of key weight that BCG felt behind development, make it possible and scalable for all of us. And we'll be talking through today how to make that work. Stepping back from that, I think the business case, the rationale for why we're doing this is pretty clear. The language we use is moving from performance management to dynamic performance development, both a change in grain size, but also a change in the focus of we're really trying to develop our employees over time. And that means frequent small conversations, clarity at a fine grain about not what we're trying to achieve for a year, but what we're trying to achieve for the next couple of weeks or a month. Getting in turn fine grain clarity on how do we do on those results over the past couple of weeks, over the past months, so we can do course corrections, and allowing us to align what the business needs, what the team needs, what the employee needs on a basis that allows us to do that frequently. And if we can pull that off, we get more data on the table, then we're able to remember the once-a-year process. Each of the conversations has less tension because it's not a high-stakes conversation, it's just another grain on the pile. That ends up being better for us as employees, it ends up being better for us as business leaders. So that's the direction we're trying to head. What we'll go through today is first, this goal is not a new goal in the world of performance management. Even when the original process was designed, it really wasn't the evil demons in the back of the HR department gleefully rubbing their hands and cackling about how can we create something that feels awkward to our teams. It was really, something that was the best stab we felt we could take at it. So why does it seem like there's so much pressure on making this change now? Because we do see just many organizations thinking about it. We'll start there. We'll talk through, well, if you're going to move down the road, what do we see as being the keys to success? We'll have kind of 3 legs of the stool is how we think of it. Out of those, we think one leg of the stool is commonly overlooked. We'll ask your opinions before we jump into that, but we'll talk about which one we think it is. And then finally, we'll say, how can you build out the capability you need to succeed on what we consider that upper leg of the stool. So that's what we'll go through today. Now let me pause first, and Virginia, see if there's any questions we have from the audience so far, any comments that you want to interject, or whether we should keep moving.
So there aren't any questions so far, Chip. So
Great.
I think we can move on.
Keep moving, great. And feel free as we go through to pop in questions. I really haven't given you a chance to pause yet. Raise comments, and we'll share them out as we go. Okay, why now? Like I mentioned, this path towards dynamic performance development, it's not based on trying to achieve a new goal. It's same old goal, trying to achieve it in a new way. So, this is a relatively recent article about how GE is moving towards the same path. They call it GE real-time performance development. And, I think the notion is if you had asked an HR leader 20 years ago, performance management, do you think that's the only time managers should talk with their team about performance? They'd kind of laugh and rub you off. We've always had that idea. Now we seem to be thinking, we can take that idea more seriously. And so the question is, in order to see how to move forward, let's first understand how did we get here? Why now? Why is this so possible? And we think there's 3 or 4 different reasons. The first is kind of the old canard, but I think it's true, that the rate of change in business continues to accelerate. So here's a chart, that of how quickly Facebook moved from not existing to serving 1 billion customers. And that's just an illustration of how fast things move. Even in, your most staid organization, the last quote was from General Electric, the most staid organization, the length of time that a plan survives before it needs to be adjusted in reaction to business reality, continues to go down. And what that means is that our need to align and realign and realign with where the business is headed must happen more quickly. So once a year becomes very awkward, when you're living in the world in which your business realities change every few months. The second has to do with how we think of the role of our leaders. So I won't play this clip, but this is a clip from the movie Office Space, and it's basically about making fun of a 1950s styles manager. You might have thought, 40 years ago that the role of a manager is to lay out the plan and state the expectations, and the role of the employee is to carry out. In today's world, many employees feel like they can Google and get advice, ask their communities and get advice and counsel about how to do their job. It's going to be near as good as what their manager can provide. It's really the role of the manager to help clarify and support the team. So as managers move to servant leaders, all of a sudden, the notion that the manager will sit with us once a year and we'll work through things, turns into a model where we expect managers to actually be spending time with their teams, supporting them on a more frequent, constant basis. So not only is the pace of change driving the need to align, but the role of our frontline manager as team lead, to help us develop and meet the goals in front of us is more of an emphasis now than simply being the order giver or the technical expert. The third of four reasons that we see for this is the level of importance that employees put on development now compared to years ago. Yeah, and I don't think it was ever the case that employees didn't care to develop, some more than others. But it's probably most pronounced if you look at millennials. So Gallup did some research on what millennials want from their job, and what came out of that was the number one thing that millennials wanted from their job. Not more money, not more responsibility. It was the ability to develop, the ability to learn and grow and develop. And so, while that stands out for millennials, I think many of us are like this in a world in which business change frequently, in a world in which it's infrequently the case that you can count on being in a good job with a good company means that you're safe, but rather it's what you know how to do rather than which organization you manage to get into is really the guarantee of future job safety. All of us care about making sure we have a great skill set and we continue to hone that skill set. So all of us now care much more dramatically about how do we make sure that we are improving our skill set over time than we did even a decade ago. So, you got a lot of drivers of demand. The final reason is an enabler. It's technology. So average professional today, some data says we receive over 100 emails. In a world in which we have emails and chat box and all sorts of communications going on through the day, the notion that we would sit down once a year for something as critical as development to talk through it, just begins to feel a little ludicrous. Our expectation as employees is our communication should be much more fluid than this. And in fact, if you kind of look at a lot of the buzz in the space right now, there's over 100 startups that Ursa and Associates have identified that are introducing new HR technology that a lot of them focused on this problem of how do we help with alignment and performance management over time. And their marketing budgets alone are driving buzz in the space because the technology is out there to begin to allow us to communicate in a way that's more flexible and fluid than we could before. So that's what we see as the major drivers of why now. Much of that has to do with its increased need. Our business needs it. We're expecting something different from our managers. They need a way to go about doing it. Employees have a bottom-up drive to learn how to increase their skills year by year. And then there's a little bit of we know better, and we have some enabling technology that will help us do that. That's what we see. Let me pause here, see if there's any questions about why now or thoughts you have about why now that we missed. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Otherwise, we'll push forward to what we see as those three legs of the stool. Victoria, let me see if there's any questions we should take.
No, there's no questions, but we did have a comment that you've been very clear in giving the information throughout your presentation, Chip. So I guess just
so
carry on.
It only goes south from here, but thank you for that. Yeah. All right. Great. So let me push ahead then. Key to succeeding. Here's how we think about it. We're in this poker game of trying to move forward towards dynamic performance development. And you step back and you say, who's in that game? Well, we've got business leaders, and they realize that their realities are changing quickly, so they want to be able to grow their teams. In a world in which skills change all the time, most companies are becoming much more like the Boston Consulting was when I was a Cub consultant, for needing to be able to increase skills, and those skills changing all the time. We need to be able to adjust what people are doing as we organize and reorganize around our customer needs. So we got the business leaders, they're in the game. You got HR leaders who, nobody likes knowing that people hate your annual management process. Furthermore, your business leaders want something different. Furthermore, your employees want something different. Furthermore, there's all this technology in the world. We should ought be able to do something different. I think the percentage of us, 75%, we're either going through or planning change at this point, indicates how hot a topic this is for HR leaders at this point. We got our line managers, the day-to-day guys who have teams and want to work with them to develop them, who want to jump in and help their teams develop. And then finally, we have the employees, and we saw the data from the millennials about, in order for me to move forward, I'd love to be able to develop. I'd like to be able to get that guidance and alignment. So we got 4 players at the table. The way we think about it is, if you want to think about what's really critical, the place to start is by saying, which of these 4 audiences are really going to be the ones who end up going to be the hard nut, the roadblock on the way to implementing change. And the way we think about it is, it's pretty clear that jumps out that the line manager here bears an awful lot of responsibility for helping do the work with the employee, but the line manager also has 100 other things to do during the day, yet another requirement on top of me, and by the way, I don't have the same level of urgency that all the other players at the table do. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today will be, how can we think through that process from the perspective of the line manager? If we go back to that, I think all too common case of Ashok getting his, 10-character annual review from his pointy-headed boss, this scenario happens all too often. And if you want to make a change, one way to think about whether you're going to succeed is to step back and ask yourself, am I creating the world in which the pointy-headed boss is going to happily, or if not happily, willingly, engage in doing a serious, continual performance development process with Ashok and his other team members? How do we cross that brook? Is really how we think about making change. And that's what we'll focus on. The way we think about it is, you can think about, a good murder mystery. The police procedure will tell you if the crime's going to be committed, that you need 3 things. You need motive, opportunity, and means. When we think about moving towards dynamic performance development, it's kind of the flip to committing the caper. It's really, how do we implement this initiative and how do we do it successfully? But we think you need basically the 3 same things. You need motive, you need opportunity, and you need skills. So what I'll do is I'll briefly walk through what do we mean by these things, and then we'll pause and get your senses as you're planning initiatives, as you've had some experience with them, as you're in the middle of it. Which of these do you see as being really the challenges that are most likely to cause you pain as you move forward? So let's jump in to say just what do we mean about these things. First, motive. If we're focusing on the pointy-headed boss and saying, how are we going to have you engaged in sand grain-sized conversations with Ashok about what his expectations are for the next couple of weeks, how they align with the business, how he's performing based on data that you gathered for that, then move forward to the next conversation. So to agilely move through a sequence of performance conversations. How are we going to get you to do that? And I think as HR people, the scary picture that forms in the back of our head is that we're going to be the kids in this picture. The pointy-headed boss will be the mule in the middle. Our job is going to be to try to push, pull, cajole to get that manager to actually carry through on the kinds of conversations that our business leaders have told us they want, that our employees have told us to want, and somehow we've found ourselves on the hook for trying to make something happen. And right there, pointy-headed boss can be in the middle. So first, we have to figure out how can we engage the pointy-headed boss and give him the motives that will lead him to want to hold those conversations. And clearly, the notion pointy-headed boss is disparaging, but that's an extreme case. The typical manager who's got operational goals already has more on his plate over time than he's been able to pull off. We keep putting new goals on the plate. Here's yet another one. How do we help that person who's feeling a bit overworked already to really want to sink his or her teeth into this and move forward? Sort of leg number 1 of the stool. Got to get there. Leg number 2. Even if we're able to say, look, we're happy to hold conversations every couple weeks. What do we talk about? And it's all too easy for those conversations to devolve into, I think I did well, I think this happened. How do we get some data on the table? So if we're really going to give Ashok and his boss, his manager, the chance to hold data-based conversations, it means we need data. and this is a place we think technology can help. We got to give them the opportunity to be able to write in a simple way what they hope to achieve. It's got to be simple if we want it to happen frequently. To gather the data in a simple way to say whether we achieved it, what course corrections do we want to make, to capture their notes about how they want to change. And this is where an awful lot of the technology investment is going. How do we enable that process so that we don't suffer what BCG suffered, which is having an army of administrators march around in the background making photocopies and distributing 4-inch stacks of paper to partners who are supposed to take them home in their briefcase and read them in preparation for the quarterly performance review that's going to happen tomorrow. So we need to provide the opportunity to make this process easy, easy, easy. And then the third leg of the stool, we think, is if you get people to want to be able to do performance management, people in particular managers, we give them the grist that allows them to hold the conversations. The third one is, how do we enable them to actually carry out those conversations? How do we enable them to have the skills that really let the boss and Ashok hold that conversation frequently? And Kenio, working with our sister organization, the Oxford Group, to make that a little concrete, have identified 5 skills that we think are common. These aren't rocket science. They'll probably be pretty familiar to you. If we're going to try to do this on a frequency basis, well, you know what? My manager should be able to set expectations clearly with me. My manager should be able to delegate, and in particular, choose great developmental opportunities that align with what we talked about when my manager delegates to me. As I run into problems and have questions, my manager should be able to coach me through them. Not necessarily give me the answer, but help me figure out the questions I should be asking when. In order to get some information, my manager is going to need to be on top of what my work is, monitor performance, and then finally, at the end of it, we're going to want to sit back and see how we did, and my manager is going to need to give me feedback. And that feedback, hopefully, is not going to simply be telling me each time what I've done wrong, how I'm a bad person, but focus more on catching me doing things right, and engage me in a conversation about how we can improve. So we got motive, we got opportunities, we got skills. Those are the 3 legs of the stool. And what our stance is, so you've decided to move down the road towards dynamic performance development, and you're able to give your line managers effective motivation so that they play the game. You're able to put systems in place where they have the data that they need in order to be able to carry out conversations, and then you're able to give them the skills they need to hold those day in and day out conversations that are required to succeed. Well, then you're in pretty good shape for being able to make real in your company the kind of great system that BCG had back in the day when I was there. So we're about to move on and say, inside your organization, as you think about making changes, which leg of the stool do you think might cause you the most problems? Before I do that, let me pause again, Victoria, see if any questions have cropped up. Otherwise, we'll keep pushing ahead.
There was one question that came through that was a question around, is there technology to support dynamic performance development?
Yeah, great question. I'll talk to a couple of different options for that in a minute. I won't propose that we are technology experts. I think the challenge is, less, is there anything out there, and more, in the torrent and deluge of things that are coming online over the past 18 months, how do we find our way? But I'll talk to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're about to hold another poll, and the question to ask yourself is this. Your organization, many of you are actually literally in the situation now. You've either launched and are in the process of, or you're planning to launch a move to change your performance management process. Where do you think you face the highest risk of failure? And Victoria, why don't I ask you to open up the poll? Is it on motive? That how can we change the culture so that this becomes just part of how we work, and in particular part of how we work for the line managers who maybe the least invested? Is it opportunity? How do we get some technology in here that's going to help us do it? Is it skills? How do we help our managers hold the day-to-day conversations? So let's give you 50 of another 5 seconds or so to see how the votes come in, and let's see how the votes move. 5, 4, tick, 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 tick. Great. Okay, Victoria, why don't you share the results back? Interesting. Okay. So this shape is similar to, slightly different than what I've seen before. So by far the largest proportion, 60%, said, our challenge is changing the culture. Smallest said it's the opportunity, deploying the technology, providing the data. The second highest is skills, enabling your managers to carry out the day-to-day conversations. So this shape of challenge around motive and challenge around skills, less around opportunity, that repeats what I've seen before. More emphasis here on motive than I've seen before. A little bit more emphasis I've seen previously on skills. Well, let me talk through kind of our reactions to these three areas and then tell you where we're going to drill down as we go forward. Happy to take questions as we go on. So by motive, here I think what we face is yet another change initiative. And in HR, I think we've seen over time, implementing technology doesn't get us change. We put the learning management system in place, we put the human resources information system in place. We know that kind of waving the technology wand doesn't get us change. What we really need is a systematic change management process to be able to work through it. And I think even stepping back to the 70s and the 80s with the rollout of enterprise resource planning systems, the rollout of those systems, a lot of work went into how do we create great change management processes. So there's academic research coming from Cotter that lays out a process to do that. There's William Bridges laid out something that comes less from a process perspective, but how do we lead people through the emotions of making a change, looking towards a better future and leaving yesterday behind? How do we sort of think through that process? I think at this point where we are as a field, that we know we have a pretty good toolkit for putting motive in place. Having the good toolkit, as we see with the 60%, doesn't get us over the hill by itself. We know that it's just simple hard work. We have to kind of check the boxes. Does somebody upstairs want this, and are they going to be willing to demonstrate their support from it in concrete ways that reinforce it in the culture? Not just send out the email saying we're moving in this direction. Can we get it to be easy enough so that people can see that they like it? Can we make the future concrete to them so they can see what success means and how it's going to make their lives better? Can we create a sense of confidence that if I take my steps on this, other people are going to do their work? Can we give people a sense of progress? All those sort of basics around change management apply here. I think what's particularly tough about it is, given the history of changes in the annual performance process, we have to double down on that work because of, I think the natural skepticism many employees will have around, oh yeah, you're going to change that? Sure. So I think just straightforward change management is the answer here. I can see that there's a lot of emphasis in the audience around, boy, that's a hard process to work through, and completely agree. The second leg, the one that least people raised their hand for, was opportunity and technology. This is where the question came up, and about is there technology in way? Each of the screenshots here is a different technology. I wouldn't deign to say, here's the technology I'd recommend. I think I'd look to an analyst in the space for that. Person is a good source. I'll just point to one example, not so much as, boy, this is the one you should choose and ride, hitch your horse to. But rather, this is one that I think has really great communication materials, and if you want to get a sense of the possibility, they make it very clear to get educated quickly. And that's the one that's shown in the upper left. It's BetterWorks, that has a process organized around what they call one key result. So the process that came out of Silicon Valley here, about how do we simplify the process by focusing down not on lots of priorities, but only on a very few priorities, work quickly against them. And so, if you're interested in one sample platform to see just how could a platform help, maybe just doing a little browsing with the marketing materials BetterWorks has would be helpful. But, this is the area where least people chose. I think the challenge here is kind of how do I pick which one I want out of lots of different, lots of noise in the marketplace. But, it's not about putting the technology in place. It's about getting people to use the technology. The final one, the third one, And this is the one where we see the most pain, is around that skills lag. How do we enable managers to hold conversations day in and day out? And the reason we think this is comes from two points of view. One is, if we want dynamic performance development to work, we need our managers to be really pretty great at holding these conversations on a frequent basis. Otherwise, managers won't feel good about doing it. Employees won't feel those conversations are valuable. We're going to fall. And there's a big gap between having, let's say, 50% of our managers highly skilled and where we are today. This is some data from a study that says how good are managers at carrying out some tactics that are like the skill, like what they need to do in the conversations we talked about. And what it shows is general pattern, less than 10% of managers are highly skilled today. Maybe half are moderately skilled, but actually about half are really pretty lousy or marginally skilled. And if we're going to succeed, we need to move that gap. We need to really kill that gap. And that, so perspective number one is big gap in those skills. While we may, second is, if you think about motive, also a big gap in the change management process, but we kind of know how to do change management. We're kind of good at doing change management. We set our mind. We know we have to rein in that stakeholder and leadership. We know we have to set the stage, and we're going to be in trouble if we don't do that well. But we kind of know the steps to take. We kind of know what counts as success. The second point of view is that when it comes to developing skills, we think actually that's an area where we're often not that, frankly, we're not that good. And so, what we're going to focus on for the next while is that third leg of the skills leg. Why is it we say, companies aren't really that good, so you tend to overlook this stage, and what is it we think organizations can do about it? Okay. This is the last chunk we're about to go into. Before I do that, Victoria, let me pause one more time, see if any questions have come up in the meantime we should jump into.
Yes, there's been one more question, and it was just around how do you get managers to buy into the change of having more conversations with their team members when thinking around their time pressures. I mean, I think you touched on it earlier in the webinar actually about them having a lot of different time pressures. So it's just around how you get them to buy into the change of having those more regular conversations.
Yeah, a huge problem. And I may sound a little bit like a broken record here, but I think it really is going to that change management playbook. Again, take our pointy-headed boss as the extreme example. We need to get our pointy-headed boss to knuckle down and hold those conversations. How are we going to do that? I think the notion is, hey, you know what? The guys upstairs really care about this. Got to make that clear. And by the way, the guys upstairs are going to put in place some system for accountability to see whether or not I'm doing it. So, I'm going to have to show up at the table because otherwise I'm going to be shown as being absent. So what you measure, you get. So that's part of it. Part of it is, that's a little bit of the push. The pull is, I have a concrete vision for how my life is going to be better if we go down this path. And so, that's storytelling. How is it that, a manager moved from being overwhelmed with trying to help his subordinates out with details to being able to have a much more comfortable life with much more capable subordinates by leading them through a development process that actually worked. At the end of the day, if you develop your team well, it should make your life much better. How can we make that concrete? And, there I think you run into change management tactics like piloting. How can we take this idea that we want to roll out to the whole company, but how can we pilot it in a little place so that we can iron out the bumps, but also how can we then use that pilot group for testimonials? Get a couple of managers who are well-known in the organization and well-respected who are willing to stand up and say, I was kind of skeptical of this, and it worked great. Let me tell you, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and I think we should all do it. Here's what my life is like now. So I think sort of leading down to testimonials. Then finally, I do think that there's this just user-centeredness kind of perspective we have to take on it. How do we do this in a way that really is drop-dead simple for everyone to play along with? And when we're thinking about choosing a technology and rolling out the plan, we got to make sure that the process is simple, that it's phrased in what's in it for you language, that we provide the communications chain and the reinforcement and even the training on the tools, that are required to be able to implement a technology process. But really, at the end of the day, this is much like implementing any other managed process, and all those tactics I just sort of walked through are similar to the tactics that you use in other cases as well. So, just a quick rundown.
Chip, there's another couple of questions, sorry. How does a more frequent, less formal review process tie in with remuneration performance bonus systems which are traditionally paid or evaluated annually?
Great question also. And, I'll give a little bit of an answer to that. But, the tie to sort of comp systems and performance, end of year pay. Our experience is, and this isn't based on research, this is just based on the organizations we work with, is a delinking between that, at the end of the year we get the big rock, and the front of the rock is how I did and what I should do next year, but I know the back of the rock is coming, and the back of the rock is what percentage is my pay going to go up. And, and I think many people's minds, these things are inextricably intertwined. They're really the same thing. And, what we see happening is as companies move towards this dynamic performance management process, how I'm doing as an employee becomes crystal clear. I have that sort of gas gauge. Am I empty? Am I full? Am I doing well? Am I not doing well? That just, ticks month by month, quarter by quarter. So at the end of the year, all that tension around where am I goes away. That doesn't mean that we need to do the pay decision every month, every quarter. No, that can stay at the end of the year. It becomes, I think, a simpler, more clear conversation, because you've kind of taken away the discovery of what do you guys think I'm doing and do you love me or not love me. That's clear by the time you reach the end of the year. Now it's simply, given the fact that I've reached the end of the year, how am I doing? And there's a whole stream of other conversations going on in the HR world about how we think about performance pay, and to what extent should we pursue it, and to what extent should it be based on team goals versus individual goals. That's a whole other topic I won't go into. But I think just in terms of the simple timing aspect, you don't really want to be monkeying with compensation frequently. Leaving that as an annual process makes sense. Decoupling it from the performance management process also makes sense. We can put this into place, still leave that at the end of the year. And actually, it works better than it worked yesterday, because I'm not doing both that discovery process as well as getting the sort of count judgment done. Okay. Other, Victoria, should we jump along?
There are a couple more questions. Is there any data or research around the improved effectiveness that comes as a result of this approach versus annual review?
I have the same question. So I think that there's a sense of enthusiasm among the early adopters. I think if you think in terms of the sort of the change curve, we're at the stage where there are some early adopters who are espousing this widely. But if you're a little bit more conservative and you're saying, let me see the data, I have not seen great data that says if you get this, if you move down this path, then you should expect to see. I personally think it makes wonderful sense. I mean, I do think that if you, sort of think about how much oomph could you be getting from your current annual process, if that's where you are, you might be pretty skeptical of that. And so almost anything would be better. So, I'm not sure that there's, in my sense, a lot of risk around will we benefit if we're able to pull this off. At the same point, if we say, what's the proven data that pulling this off will make us a better company and show up in our stock price, I haven't seen the data on that. Let me take one more, Virginia, and then actually I'm going to push ahead just to make sure we get through some more of the material before we wrap up.
Yep, so one more question. Is it possible to have a uniform approach to performance management, considering that we are talking about different managers or leaders who have different approaches to the way in which they work?
Yeah, so yeah, given that we got different folks in the world, can we wrap them all into a single process? I mean, short story is, I think yes. I think that while different folks will have different priorities and different communication styles, different preferences for how they want to spend their time, I actually do think it's perfectly feasible to put in a base process. Here's the way in our company we help our team develop. We care about it because it's easy to lay out why. Our business is changing. We've been through some of that today. We want to make our employees successful over time, and there's a way we do that. And it's a way that we've really worked hard to make simple and practical, worked hard to enable it, and we want you to follow it. We want everybody to have this kind of experience. And I do think, even, you talk about, boy, will the same thing work in sales as in operations as in manufacturing? Will the same thing work for co-located teams versus virtual teams? There's, I think, idiosyncrasies that make you kind of color between the lines a little bit. But overall, the notion that, yeah, if we move to a company, can we expect that in the end our rollout will say, after we've moved through all our functions, we're all going to be using the same process? Short story, yeah, I think absolutely practical to do that. Well, let me pause for a second. These are really great questions, and it makes me wish that we had twice the time and more of an interactive format that we could have a back and forth on it. But we're bumping up against our time limits, and being that, let me push ahead for a little bit, see if I can leave a couple of minutes at the end for some more questions. Like I mentioned, we put our stake on the place where we think most organizations struggle as they move, is on this day-to-day skills basis. And you might ask, how hard can that be? We're talking about having managers hold pretty simple conversations around setting expectations, coaching, getting feedback. How hard can that be? All we need to do is we need to recruit the right people into our management ranks so that they, have the potential to do that. We need to give them a development experience that gives them those skills. We need to coach them through on the job so that they learn how to apply those skills in their day-to-day. It's almost like a performance management task in and of itself. Now, I think a little bit of the data shows, well, most organizations haven't cracked the code. We're really pretty far from that. In terms of recruiting, what tends to happen in an organization isn't that we, have a large body of folks who are hoping to lead teams, and we're picking and choosing among them based on aptitude. Really we're doing is we're taking our best individual performers and we're saying, hey, you're bright and bushy tail, let's have you be a team leader now. That means that these are accidental folks who don't necessarily come with a skill set or even necessarily an intention to be leaders and hold the kind of conversations. Then we invest in developing them. There's a fair amount of data that shows that that investment doesn't have the impact we'd like it to have. This particular quote is 40% of what we cover in training never gets applied back on the job. And that may be a little bit of an optimistic view given some other studies. If you step back at the end of the day, HR managers rate their line managers as their least ready work group, even less capable than entry-level employees. We're just not doing great on that. So, not only, if you look at where managers are today, very few are really skilled at these conversations. We've tried as HR teams in the past to be able to get them skilled. It's not that we don't have entry to welcome to management programs in place in our organizations, and we haven't been able to succeed at that. So what we'll dig into next is a little bit about, well, how can we change that? And we've done some work over the past couple of years in this space. Oops, looks like the slide auto advanced. I'm going to go back once, take a glimpse. It's going to auto advance again. I'll keep talking. What we've heard from talking organizations is that many face exactly the same profile in how they think about developing their line managers to hold the kind of conversations we talked about, which is we promote our best and brightest, we know what we want them to be able to do, we bring them in often for workshops, sometimes we give them other experiences. They rate those experiences really highly. They say, thanks for paying attention to me. The content is really valuable. We end up with those workshops and we say, okay, now it's time for you to go back and apply this stuff in the context of your day-to-day work. They say, great, let me do that. They go back on the job, and that's where they fall off that cliff. We've seen this, that the transfer from those development programs to actual practice has been pretty lousy, both according to the individuals we talk to in the industry and what I think the data shows. And I think if you step back and think about that from a manager's perspective, we've already talked a bit about time pressures, you can understand why that is. Particularly new managers, are faced with 100 demands, and at the top of the list is shipping at the end of the day. Second is figuring out that quality problem and staffing need by the end of tomorrow. The notion that I'll apply what I learned in training is important, but that's priority 5. If I get through priority 2 by the end of the day, well, then I'm feeling pretty good. So, what we think coming out of that is that we as HR people and learning and development people should really shift the target. Instead of thinking, oh, we've done a great job when we brought people in and provided some great training, we should instead set the stage so that instead the result is really, you show results at the end of the day. That if you're one of these managers, that at the end of the day, you show results. In particular, you show that you demonstrate proficiency on the job. And in order to do that, we think there's a couple of tricks. Just a few minutes left. I'm going to move kind of quickly through this. But key to that, the first one is, if we want to develop those skills, we need to put actually a dynamic performance development process in place. We need to move away from the notion of, let's give you an online course, let's bring you in for a couple of workshops. We need to move away from the idea that we've injected you with some event, and instead move you through a journey. And the chart lays out some details of the journey. We don't think this is rocket science. That basically is, let me prepare so that by the time I'm done preparing, I realize that this is something I really want to get better at. I have a sense of what it would mean for me to be better. Let's give me the skills. Let me learn how to set expectations, how to coach. Let me then not just stop and say, please go forward and practice, but put that inside our journey. Let me go out and deliberately practice, deliberately experiment with the skills and using them on the job and using the models. That's going to feel uncomfortable. Anything I do new is going to feel uncomfortable. Let's put me in a situation where I'm willing to work through that discomfort. And then let me pause and reflect on that and see whether or not I got to where I wanted to get, whether I met the goals I set for myself up front, and whether I can review. So we think that natural people, there are some people who just naturally develop their skills over time. They kind of automatically put themselves through this process. We think actually structuring everybody's experience around this process allows most people to get the kind of results that those who are great at developing themselves do. So if you want to move to develop those skills, we think from event to journey is key. Part of that is, let's take the load off of the training guy's shoulders. Again, the auto problem, but let's instead leverage the existing skill structure. And what that means, the team structure. What we mean by that is, we, the HR group, the L&D group, we can create the system that's going to enable you to master those skills. But to do that, you're going to work with your manager to get coaching through that. We can make that process simple for you, and you're going to work with your team to understand what works for them and to practice with them. And so we need to have you work with your team. And again, to make that happen, just like we talked about with change management, there needs to be some accountability. So the business leaders can see whether the managers are actually working with you on your skills. Your manager can see whether you're doing the practice you need to do. There's a way to see whether or not you're making progress or not. And we think by putting those pieces in place, we can get beyond our current inability to develop management skills. This data that we've been looking at for a little bit longer than I planned to have us look at is actually from an experiment we conducted with one of our clients using these 3 ideas: event to journey, leverage the team structure, provide a system of accountability. And basically this was with experienced managers who'd already been in the job for several years, really actually had pretty good skills, rated themselves before they jumped in, rated themselves afterwards, and the short story is, in the course of a month, having the target that they saw as their area for improvement, we were able to have them cut their skill gap by about 50%. So we think that these ideas enable us to make building skills a managed process, kind of like change management. We move towards having a good toolkit that enables us to do it if we roll up our sleeves into the elbow grease. So let me pause there. I think our sense is, again, stepping back, many organizations moving towards dynamic performance development. We agree with the business case, also agree with the comment earlier that there's not necessarily a lot of research behind it. In order to get there, what we propose is you got to think of how am I going to get my line managers to play the game, because they're going to be my audience, which is most at risk. And in order to do that, you need to work through the motive, the change management. You need to make the process easy. That involves technology. And we need to use skills, and that's where we focused at the tail end on how can we actually implement a systematic approach that gets us the skills we need. Okay, let me pause. Thanks for joining today. I think we're running up on the time that we asked for, so we are at the hour. Let me spend if you need to drop out, understood, and let me spend 5 minutes just taking any additional questions that come before we wrap up for today. Victoria, any other questions we should tackle before we sign off?
No, I think all the questions have been answered now, Chip. So thank you very much for that presentation. It was very informative. And just to clarify, we will send out the slides after, and the recording of this webinar after the event. So probably in a couple of hours, we'll send those out. And also we'll send out a little bit of information that we found on kind of dynamic performance development that's come from places like Harvard Business Review and things like that as well. So just to really back up, I guess, what we've talked about today. So yeah, so thank you, Chip. I don't know if you've got any closing comments just to share with the group before we sign off.
Yeah, great. So just two. I mean, one, just let me reiterate my thanks for coming and joining first thing in the morning. Second, we think this is an area that's really evolving rapidly. So if you have other questions, if you have comments you'd like to share, please do. Here's my contact information. I'd love to hear from you. So that's it for me. Thanks again for joining. And 75% of the group is looking to make a change. So good luck as you push forward with your efforts.
Great. Okay, thank you, Chip. And thank you, like Chip said, to everyone for joining us. And we'll send out the information very shortly. So thank you. Goodbye.